Yeah. So with reference to pesticides, that was a question that I wanted to ask you. Is this purely a financially driven thing? If the data has been proven since, I think, the 60s or for the last 60 years, then obviously something's going on, which is giving whoever it is that's developing, selling these products some level of confidence or arrogance to keep doing so. But to the average person, you hear that and you think, oh, surely evil doesn't exist so blatantly in an industry like this. But it does seem amazing that when you have a team of people around you with the same goals, with the same quarterly reports that need to be developed to stockholders, shareholders, to the public, then all of a sudden it seems very easy to justify a lot of questionable behavior in the name of profits.
Well, the pesticide companies can speak for themselves, but fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Um, in the 40s and 50s, we had, and well into the 90s, we had tobacco companies deliberately obscuring the adverse health effects of smoking. Lung cancer in the United States, lung cancer deaths in the United States 100 years ago was almost zero. I'll say that again. Lung cancer, leading cause of cancer death in the United States, leading cause of cancer death in the world, almost didn't exist 100 years ago. It wasn't until the advent of cigarettes in the early 1900s in the United States that 25 years later you see a corresponding rise in the rates of lung cancer deaths. One of the great public health achievements, Surgeon General report in the United States 1962, smoking causes lung cancer. Smoking peaks, decreases, and 25 years later, the rates of lung cancer decrease. If you think it's just not lung cancer, I mean, look at the opioid epidemic, which I'm sure has affected Australia as well as it has the United States. If you want to look at modern things, look at social media. I mean, look at the reporting from the Wall Street Journal indicating that companies, some of these social media companies, know about the toxic effects of social media on the mental health of teenagers, especially teenage girls, 1/3 of whom are depressed in the United States. And they continue to engage in this behavior. If we know that, according to reports from The Guardian, that a pesticide manufacturer is doing this for paraquat, we should ask what other environmental toxicants is this applying to for Parkinson's, and what other environmental toxicants is this applying to for other diseases, prostate cancer, breast cancer, heart disease, and many other conditions.
I'm sure there's a lot of people listening who go, okay, well, paraquat, it's something which is used on farms. It's something which is used, as you say, to kill the things that Roundup can't kill, if I've understood you correctly. And so a lot of people hear that and they say, okay, well, I'm not on a farm. I'm in a coastal town. I'm not on a farm. I'm in a city. I'm nowhere near that. But I guess the use of these pesticides is far and wide and can be quite deceptive in the way that it finds its way to you. So how is it that people through or people who are nowhere near where something like a pesticide like paraquat is being used are being impacted by it? My guess is obviously the fruits, the vegetables, the things that we're eating are being heavily sprayed, or at least copying a little bit of the offshoot of sprays. Farmers, I mean, it makes sense. I think I've heard you speak about the extent of farmers and their the rates of exposure to these pesticides and the rates of increase in Parkinson's disease. But could you talk to that a little bit? Because it sometimes seems that people consider themselves separate from where these sprays are actually being used.
Yeah. So at a high level, if you look at Parkinson's disease, there are numerous studies in numerous parts of the world that show a near perfect correlation between the rates of Parkinson's disease and the amount of pesticide used in rural areas. So in Canada in the 1980s, this guy, Barbeau, showed a near perfect correlation between rates of pesticide use in rural parts of Canada and rates of Parkinson's disease. That same kind of study has been replicated in France and vineyards. It's been replicated in Israel and other parts of the world. Now, so in rural areas, I think pesticides are a big issue. I think in urban areas, I think trichloroethylene, these industrial solvents, and air pollution are a big issue. But we should be mindful, as I said, early childhood exposure could be what's laying the seeds for people developing Parkinson's disease 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years later. So even though you may now live in Sydney, you may now live in Melbourne. How do you pronounce
No,
Melbourne?
you did pretty well, Melbourne.
Melbourne you could have been growing up on a farm, and you may not even grown up on a farm. You could just been growing in a rural area, and they spray the pesticides. Paraquat, for example, is sprayed, and you could be inhaling it. And we've been warned about this. Rachel Carson in 1962, she wrote Silent Spring, not because she was against pesticides, she was against the indiscriminate use of pesticides, especially DDT and this class of fat-soluble, fat-dissolving pesticides called organochlorines. And it turned out there's another new condition. So I mentioned that Parkinson's first major description is in 1817. There's another Parkinsonian disorder called dementia with Lewy bodies. It's basically really bad Parkinson's plus really bad dementia mixed together. And the first report of that condition was 1976. So the first report of this condition, which is estimated to affect up to 1 million Americans, is in 1976 in Japan by a Japanese psychiatrist who was wondering whether this was a new disease. He even has that question in one of the titles of his paper. So I looked back and I said, well, what's in the water and the food in 1960 in Japan around this time? And it turns out after World War II, Japanese start spraying DDT and other pesticides called organochlorines on the rice paddies. And these pesticides dissolve in fat. And so they looked at the fat levels of these pesticides in the fat tissue, in the adipose tissue of Japanese, of the population. And you could see a corresponding rise in the rates of these fat-soluble pesticides in people's fatty tissues, like, subcutaneous fat. They see the rise of these pesticides, probably because they're consuming it, probably in their food, because it's fat-soluble. And then it correlates with the appearance of a new disease. And as soon as Japan bans DDT and other pesticides in the 1970s, you see a corresponding decline in the levels of this. And we see this in Europe, we see this in the United States, where you stop using these pesticides, the levels of these pesticides and their metabolites in people's fatty tissue drops. And I think that's a hopeful silver lining that as these things drop, you could see in the future lower rates of Parkinson's disease, lower rates of dementia with Lewy bodies. Now it's a hypothesis, it needs to be tested, it needs to be proven, but there's a lot of hope here that if we stop using these environmental toxicants and stop using them indiscriminately, and stop using them in increasing amounts, we can create a world where Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, and other diseases are increasingly rare.